Hello everyone, my name is Wayne Barnum. This is the first topic lecture for the first quarter tournament for Alaska MSPDP debate resolved. Cell phones should not be banned in K through 12 public schools. This is an interesting motion. We voted on it a few times last year. Didn't see it make it really far in the voting. But it's nice to see that it's actually here for once. I think it'll be a pretty good pragmatic debate. I think it'll be very solid, and there's a lot of avenues I think for both sides. I think this is a pretty good topic selection. Let's look at the actual avenues we're going to discuss today. We're going to talk about motion analysis, talking about what the definitions are, how to understand them. We're going to go through background information, somewhat of a history of cell phone bans, and where we're at in society. Then we're going to go through a little bit of framework showcase, talking about how the round can and cannot function. Then we're going to go through a few case ideas. Okay, cell phones. Cell phones in general are these. Pretty cool. But coming from Oxford Dictionary, it's a portable wireless telephone that works on a cellular network. The key function to explain why cell phones are different from, say, a Chromebook or a computer is that they work off of a cellular function rather than being more focused on like Wi-Fi. It's also that you can explain the difference. I don't actually know those differences. I'm a teenager. But the actual reason I think you can explain why cell phones and computers are different, which I think is a key distinction around that you might have to make, is that cell phones in and of itself are focused on mobile function and are focused on a handheld idea. Whereas computers are very large and computers have a much vaster array of functions. Phones are more meant for communication purposes than anything else, and computers have a wide variety of communication among them. That's how you can make a key distinction between the two, which I think might have to happen in a number of rounds. When it comes to ban has a number of different definitions. I like the Cambridge one, which is essentially just to forbid something officially. I think that to explain that this is official is also generally a good thing. You can explain the actor that is doing it as that all schools would agree to a cell phone ban, or the United States federal government enforces a cell phone ban. That's really your choice. But the key thing when it comes to banned is that it's an official action. It's not just a teacher asking you, "Hey, can you put your phone away for the day?" and it's just being suggested. It is official. That is official rules that you agree to in order to be at the school. And so you can make that distinction. I don't think it's going to come up in a lot of rounds, but I think it's an important thing to know. Further on K through 12 public schools. Okay, K through 12 public schools are generally classified by two key things. That one, they're funded by a government agency or the government in and of itself. Think of it as the Department of Education, or that it's universally accessible. We can think of it as how say a Christian academy might not be universally accessible, where say Mirror Lake Middle School might be fully accessible for people in the region. That's how you can kind of make those distinctions. There's a number of variety of different ways to understand it. That's the key big idea there. But you can also explain it of what K 12 public schools aren't. They aren't private schools. They aren't home schools. They aren't charter schools. They're schools that those are schools that have reasons why you wouldn't automatically be entered to the school. The distinction to make with K through 12 public schools is that generally it's universally accessible and also government funded. I think the second part about government funding is probably going to be why you have a lot of reasoning for why cell phone bans are being pushed right now. Okay, on to background info. There's a number of different things we need to cover when it comes to why cell phone ban is a relevant topic. So for a bit of history analysis, we can look at that phones since about World War II are becoming really relevant ideas. The idea of mobile communication really starts to pick up after the conflict, and there's a whole gap between that and 2007. But notice between that period, the rate at which people are trying to access mobile communication or direct communication is really starting to take shape. And then we get to 2007, the year I was born. I know, sorry. Um, Apple releases the iPhone, and it's not the first mobile phone by any means, but it is fundamentally one that really starts to revolutionize how we understand direct communication and mobile communication. Fast forward to today, about 97% of adults have a cell phone today. It's crazy numbers that in the span of about 18 years, probably even less than when the statistic came out, that about almost everyone in Western liberal democracies have cell phones, and it's really freaking cool. Um, but looking at classrooms, which is I think is a bigger distinction for this round, in about 2020, 80% of classes being like actual classes or it can be in actual schools, have some form of ban on cell phones. We see this as being somewhat of an uptick in trends since about 2007, closer to 2010 is the starting point. Fast forward to actually today, 2025, the numbers actually increased. You can find that statistic yourself. But specifically, understand that the amount of phones that are being used in class, the second part, is really seeing an uptick. About 70 or 97% of students use their cell phone during class. And so we're starting to see this kind of conflict in schools where there's ban on cell phones, but also an uptick in usage of cell phones, and they always come into conflicts with each other in about every case. Um, and so you can start to see that dynamic shape out on how when we look at ASD specific policy, the way that bans are enforced is more focused on removal rather than focused on trying to teach how not to use phones. And so we're starting to get a really interesting dynamic on how schools relate themselves to phones and how students go about their life with that knowledge. Okay, that's enough background info. Let's get to a bunch of debate nerd stuff. Okay, we're gonna go here. So you can read the whole list about what I think the debate is going to be about. I think all those are valid. Those are more likely going to be ideas for issue questions, like which side reduces distractions in class, which side helps students with focus, which side helps students with safety, which side helps prevent disruptions. Ignore that there's a spelling error with capital I. We're going to focus on the last two because I think the first one is just areas you can cover, areas you can explain in round that have relevance. This is primarily a list that third speakers can understand of where the round is going to go, so they can make issue questions. Big parts about what the debate isn't about. The debate's not about are there good teachers or bad teachers. I think that's a part of the conversation, but it shouldn't be the biggest part of the conversation. But it also shouldn't be about whether or not technology is good or bad, just period in general. I think there's actually good arguments to explain that tech in the classroom is good or bad, but I don't think that the conversation about tech in a holistic society sense is necessarily a good or bad thing. I think that takes the debate away from what it was originally meant to be and makes it really complicated for a judge to evaluate. But then the last part about is school needed in the first place? I think it's a valid conversation to have, but I don't think it's going to be one that's really going to win you debates, but also make it very clear on what you want out of the round. We think about debate rounds as being primarily about getting the most education possible. And so you can have the conversation about if schools are needed in the first place, but it's largely going to make it harder to have the conversation about cell phones in schools when we talk about schools' existence in the first place. It really shifts the goalpost for the round. And so try and keep the round centered on the relationship between cell phones, students, and school administration. For values of this round, we can think about values as more principled argumentation, but key ideas or key principles we want to uphold in a round in order to envision a better future. I'll come up with just a few. You can come up with your own. But safety is a really relevant one. We'll delve into that when we get to argument construction, but also quality of life, about how students are able to go about their life in a fulfilling manner. We can also see that a value for the round can be setting students up for success, about prosperity for those students, and about learning and about communication. I think all those are pretty valid for principled argumentation or setting up a framework for the round to explain what the round is supposed to really be about who can make students safe, why is making students safe matter, and what does that really look like. That kind of covers all the background information before we get to argument construction. Okay, all arguments that I have provided, at least for this topic lecture, animal testing one might be a bit different, but that's a side conversation. Um, Follow an inherency link impact structure. It'll become clear what that kind of looks like when we get there. Inherency just means what the world looks like right now and what's good or bad about it, depending on your side. The link is just how the motion that we have today relates to the first part, and then the impact is really the outcome of the argument in and of itself, following the first two ideas. Key point here, these should be starting ideas or starting points. I want you to come up with your own contentions. This is to give you an idea of the background information of what people might run, how to prepare, knowing that people might run these types of arguments, and to explain to you how to understand when it comes to building arguments rather than directly taking and using these. Acknowledge that I am going to be one of your judges, and if I see you try and rip these off, I won't blame you for it, but I might judge you because it might be different from what I put. Okay, safety. There's three key ideas here. Firstly, that schools aren't always safe. School shootings have really seen an uptick in the last number of years. There's been over 100 for the past few years. I think, since for over a decade. And it's really disruptive. And that's thousands of students that don't go home. But also, when looking outside of school shootings, there's also natural disasters. We can specifically look to to the southern East Coast, where there's constant hurricane or constant natural disasters in which there needs to be communication between parent and student to make sure that that student is safe, but also that students can get out of that situation. What cell phones do, secondly, is that cell phones allow contact with parents during these emergencies. They can be notified of situations and they can clarify pickup locations and can make it pretty easy for student and parent to be able to get to one another without having to go through the middleman of the administration. What cell phone bans do in the second part is that it makes it really hard for parents and students to have that key line of communication and trying to get through one body of administration when there's 800 parents and 800 students all trying to be able to contact one another. It's really hard to be able to get to that connection in an emergency. We can think back to the earthquake a few years ago, like 2019, 2018. I don't quite remember. It was my fifth grade. But during that, GCI went down, and the schools, such as my school, like in Birchwood ABC, weren't able to get in contact with my parents. And so it became really hard for the students and for the parents to get in contact with each other during emergencies. But the third part of this argument is that when we have cell phones in schools, this makes parents and students feel safe. That parents are in the loop and are able to cooperate with emergency services at an easy rate, which means there's likely easier to get faster help, but also that students are able to get out of harmful situations. If there's a natural disaster, they can contact their parent, and their parents can clarify where they need to go in order to get back to them, can find out how the parents can get to them in order so they can both get out of that natural disaster or that emergency situation. I think all these are valid arguments of why cell phones are kind of needed in schools. You can explain in your own part in that second section about cell phones, while contact the parents in emergencies, about what a world without cell phones in schools would look like, or what a world with a ban would look like. Of that you can't get access to those key benefits with a ban. And so when you're on the proposition and you argue that cell phones should not be banned in school, this is a reason why they are somewhat of a necessity in school. Okay, next argument. Education. So, three ideas here. First, that educational outcomes are declining. We're starting to see very low test scores for Gen Z and specifically for Gen Alpha. And we can somewhat contribute this to technology in general, but we see the key part of this is due to a number of different factors. It also comes from school funding dropping. We can see ASD's massive debt and deficit starting to come up and starting to bleed into how classrooms are able to function, where teachers can have less resources and are unable to really match the level of resources that are found online. But secondly, what cell phones in schools can do is that they can be used in classrooms. They can be used for interactive learning, such as Kahoot, and with low-cost learning materials. The way that you distinct this from computers is you explain that the ASD Chromebooks generally are slow, that they require constant maintenance due to like the poor service that ASD provides with the low funding that they do towards the computer technology, or that some classrooms flat out just don't get access to those online resources because they don't have the computers necessary. And what phones do is act as a replacement that is reliably fast, that is accessible at all times, but then also is available for a student outside of class. So what this does, thirdly, is help with educational outcomes. Of that when students have better ability to have interactive learning, and also learning that better caters to their needs because of access to all the resources found online in the classroom, we see a key match with higher test scores, and that students are more likely to have success when it comes to those tests and when it comes to their academic performance. With those increases in scores, performance, and outcomes, schools are more likely to get funding from a national level or from a state level. We can see how like often the case is that schools that have the higher scores get higher funding. If all schools have the higher scores, more likely to get higher funding. And what that funding can do is can help with infrastructure. It can be the avenue to get students access to reliable technology outside of phones, and can generally be the means on how schools such as Chugiak High School are able to get the funding necessary to support teachers staying, necessary to allow students to get the best education possible so that they don't go off to other schools such as middle college, and that Chugiak then loses prominence. It'll be really beneficial to explain that if cell phones have a net benefit when it comes to the education of people in schools, that it's likely to lead to schools overall getting better. This is why you explain that cell phones in schools are actually a net benefit for schools in and of themselves. Okay, third prop idea, self-control. Three ideas. One, that students generally lack self-control with their phones. Of that, we're seeing that phones in classrooms are really being seen as distractions. But we're also seeing a general across the board with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, a declining attention span in and outside of classrooms is becoming a bigger and larger issue. But secondly, what phones can do in schools is teach self-control. Of that, if we understand cell phones as being a tool in school, we can treat it as such and explain to students how to use it in those regulated understandings. And so we can have dedicated times for learning with cell phones, and the teachers can use their phones. Teachers can explain the varied use for cell phones. It's not just social media and not just communication. It can fill the spots of the failure that ASD Chromebooks have, and it can be used as means for learning outcomes. And we can start to change narratives on cell phones of always being distractions and always ruining attention span to when we have dedicated times for cell phones in schools. And when we tie it to education, we're likely to see that people's relationship between phones and education are likely to improve. And what this does is it sets students up for success. That when students are likely to have better classroom etiquette when they know when and when not to use their cell phone, when they know in class what is an appropriate time to access it, or when there's appropriate times to access it for educational material. And what that does likely is help students understand opt-in, opt-out time windows for using phones, which helps with their attention spans. It makes it easier for them to recognize long-form material of information when they're on phones using it for the variety purpose. That's not just constant information flow from social media. If if we can use phones in avenues that aren't just harmful to their attention spans, like using it for education, there'll be a dissociation with attention harming like social media websites. And it'll make it easier for students to have long form attention spans when the source of their attention span deficit starts to change in and of itself. And this actually sets students up for better future jobs. That when students are able to have better attention spans, have better etiquette, and have better education, we're starting to see that they're set up for success. That they're able to have self control in the future, and employers will somewhat like that. And more likely than not, they'll be better at their jobs, and more likely than not, they'll have higher retention for both education and their jobs. This is how you explain that cell phones in schools can actually either prevent distraction or is a net benefit for the long-term outcome for students. It's kind of a complicated one. If you have any questions, email me. Okay, last prop argument, tech scares. First idea here is that schools and districts overall don't actually understand how to approach cell phones in classrooms, but also technology in general. We see specifically back to the Chromebooks that there's low quality technology in schools, and then there's bigger overarching concerns about funding allocation. Look again towards ASD and its issues with funding always popping up. We can see that schools don't actually know when to fund certain technological avenues in certain schools, and it always leaves up to the question on how students will actually get funding for better access to resources. This also establishes further that technology isn't scary because it has the best access to educational resources. Most of your Canvas shells are an example of online resources. And what cell phones in schools do is it encourages tech in the classroom, ignore the capital L, because it shows schools and administrators the varied options for learning. That if they are providing students with failing resources and the students show up and provide their own resources and avenues to get access to those resources that are fast acting, then the schools have to address it. The schools have to acknowledge their own inadequacies. And it shows them that if tech in the classroom is actually leading to student benefits, i.e., we can look at this contention or this contention or this contention, then we're likely to see that the schools will acknowledge the benefits of technology in schools. And we'll see that they'll likely change their minds and make up their minds. And this leads to the third part about this helps schools make decisions, that it'll help determine funding for schools and curriculums, that they're more willing to put in resources towards technology if we can show them that those resources that they're providing are inadequate. And if they provided the adequate ones, that we would have the best possible education. And it means that with funding, we're likely going to see that best possible education outcomes for students if they have the actual resources necessary for them to be able to succeed. Those are the four prop arguments I propose. Again, I encourage you to come up with your own. A lot of these are complicated. A lot of these need work on my own, especially this one. But I think these are starting points. Let's jump towards the opposition. Okay. Student safety. I'm going to go right here. I want to fix it. Okay. Student safety. Okay, this is a contradictory point to the proposition safety point. Okay, first premise that cell phones in schools make students generally unsafe. This continues on the conversation that there is a rise in the number of school shootings, but also that studies have proven that phones in schools have led to more deaths of students in those shootings. But also taking it outside of just school shootings, when it comes to natural disasters, cell phones are providing distractions in emergencies. That when it comes to planning for those emergencies, what cell phones are doing is that students are looking for alternative avenues to understand how to be safe and understand how to get out. We can look at it as them trying to look up what's happening on their phone rather than trying to listen to a teacher and know that they need to get out. It critically, cell phones are taking away from the ability of students to get out in an emergency situation. The second premise is that a ban would get rid of these distractions. Specifically, that without a cell phone, students are more likely to be focused on getting out when they aren't trying to find out what is happening with their phone or getting the misinformation that can exist from other students across the school or online due to news outlets that students will have limited information overload. This goes back to the first premise of that when trying to search what's happening or trying to find out what's happening when you are in a key situation in which you might be harmed, your processing becomes a lot harder. And so what a ban would do is that would prevent the information overload that would happen with both a cell phone and with a disaster. And what this critically then does is lead to less distractions for those students. And this is a third premise, that this is what helps save lives, that students are able to make it out alive of a disaster when they have less distractions, when they can make the critical decisions, when there's less information overload, and they can focus on getting out. This, as a result, means that students are better able to speak out about their experiences. Or they can call out the inadequacies of natural disaster infrastructure in schools. They can call the inadequacy of schools to protect students, and and those advocacies can turn into real policy action. This contention, I think, is probably one of the bigger ones, especially because it has so many avenues to go down. But if you can explain that cell phones are a net harm onto students when it comes to safety, then I think that you can have a pretty clear round, especially when it comes to fighting this proposition safety point. Okay, next neg argument. Minimizing distractions. This is a different avenue from the first one about distractions and emergencies. Let's make it pretty clear. Okay, firstly, that cell phones are harming education. We're seeing cell phones are being distractive in schools, specifically due to like the blue light that happens from the digital screen on phones, and from like how that every buzz on a phone provides us a small level of dopamine in your brain. And what this generally does is that it leads to less focus on materials for those students. And this overall leads students to set up to fail. That they have low attention spans, acknowledging the conversation for proposition, but also there's an over reliance on their cell phones. What a ban would do is that a ban, secondly, would eliminate those distractions and likely lead to increased test scores. That when students aren't on their phones in class and aren't able to be on their phones in class, they don't have that dopamine overload. They don't have those distractions in the classroom that are taking away from their material in the classroom, and they are more likely, with less distractions and with less ways to opt out of listening to classroom information, are more likely to be focused on the teaching that is in front of them. And this helps lead further with longer times away from cell phones. That with longer times away from that constant dopamine, or longer times away from the buzz of the phones, you have easier, more dedicated time away from it. And specifically in an educational environment where you have dedicated time to be able to be focused on those learning outcomes, I think it's going to be a lot easier to understand why exactly there's less distractions in schools. And this, thirdly, helps students succeed in life. That when students are set up to have better attention spans in a specific area, such as like on a job, which we can simply articulate is close to education, that they're less reliant on their phones in certain avenues. That when there's key dedicated times, away from it, that students aren't always needing it 24/7, but also that students have better focus. That when they're in situations in the future where they're on a job or when they need to make a critical decision, they can focus on it without without their phone always being in the back of their mind. I think that this point is really a good clash for the self-control and then also the education point. Okay, last neg argument. Educational outcomes. This is a key clash with the proposition education point. And you'll notice that all three of these arguments focus stemly on the idea about distractions in schools. I want you to come up with your own ones that would be different from that, because I think it'd be really interesting to find the other avenues. Because I got really stuck on this one. Okay, educational outcomes. First idea that students are distracted in the classroom right now. Cell phones are taking away from student learning and critically are dividing their attention. Kind of a different starting point from the last contention. And what this is doing is that it's leading to lower test scores. That when students critically are less focused on material, that they have an inability to replicate the knowledge from those materials when you aren't having time dedicated to it. Phones are taking away times to understand material for classrooms. The second idea here is that a ban will reduce those distractions. That when there's less use in classrooms, or that when there's a ban in a classroom, that students have less avenues to be distracted and with less avenues to have divided attention. Rather than having a phone trying to compete with teachers for attention, there's just the teacher to have that attention. That is more likely to lead to students being focused on classroom materials. There's actually a great study done that explained that students write down 62% more details in their notes when they don't have access to a cell phone in a classroom. And they also found that without a cell phone in a classroom, students are more likely to have a full letter grade higher when there's a ban in place, or when they are more able to be focused on classroom. And what this does is that it's easier for students to get higher test scores. It's easier for students to pass classes. It's easier for students to have higher GPAs because it's pretty clear that it's easier to be focused and dedicated in the classroom without the key distraction of cell phones. And this leads to the third part about helping with educational outcomes. Although when there's better test scores and better grades, when students are succeeding more, there's better funding. And as the conversation earlier from proposition, when there's better funding, there's easier access for infrastructure for students to get access to the resources they need to succeed, and students, as a result, get the best possible education. You'll notice from all these contention discussions that at some point each one of these clashes with another. About the proposition safety clashes with the opposition safety, but the proposition education clashes with the opposition education. That the tech scare argument actually still ties into the last two about distractions in schools and technology. And so think about how those all interact in a round, and then when you go about your round, try and find those examples and make it clear why your side comes out on top. That's all from me. If you have any questions, please email me. My email's right there. I think this will be an interesting topic. I think it could be really fun. And I hope the best for all of you. Um, I think that every argument is likely to be valid, but make sure that you explain out why your argument matters and you explain a very clear logical link chain as to why you start from step A to B to C to D to E. And if you can do that, you're likely to win over most of your judges. See you next time.